So I'm going to skip over the quote from Kingsnorth that I use at the beginning of the blog post. You've heard it before. And it just kind of sets up why we're looking at capitalism. We're getting deep down the rabbit hole and talking about Martin Luther and Protestantism generally and its relationship to capitalism, which is in the 100 years plus years since Max Weber published his book, there has been discussion and disagreement with his thesis, at least parts of his thesis. I think it's still helpful. I don't think one can deny, even if you don't detach it from Protestantism, at least the sense in which the capitalist way, the spiritual kind of qualities of what it means to live in a capitalist society have influenced all modern people. So we're really, in a sense, talking about the spiritual effect of capitalism. It's interesting to tie it in with Protestantism because I think there is something there that Max Weber, a sense that Max Weber had, even if there have been arguments that capitalism could be found in other places. And I mean, capitalism has existed in a sense. There's been market, free market of sorts in really almost every society. Even in kind of a communist society, there still be like a black market. So even if it's not the main economic model, it's a part of it. So enough said. So last week we began looking at some of the main influences of the Protestant Reformation on the development of modern capitalism. As Orthodox Christians living in a capitalist society, it's important to understand the ways in which capitalism affects the spiritual life of modern people, albeit for most of us subconsciously. Last week we looked at Martin Luther's idea of calling, and this week we are looking at another aspect of Max Weber's critique of Protestantism, his idea of disenchantment, with an emphasis on how one responds to the object of one's enchantment through asceticism. One of Weber's chief theses in his landmark work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which he published in 1905, is that the Protestant Reformation brought about the eventual disenchantment and Zauberung of the world. Paul Kingsnorth, in chapter 4 of Against the Machine, argues that Weber was at least partially incorrect in that the world has not actually become disenchanted, but simply that the old object of enchantment, which was God, has been replaced by a new object of enchantment, money. And here's the quote from Kingsnorth. This quote-unquote disenchantment thesis, as we might call it, has been influential for over a century now. But is it really true? Historian Eugene McCarraher has taken issue with it. In his book, The Enchantments of Mammon, he argues that modernity did not, in fact, dispense with the West's sacred order, leaving only a desiccated materialism in its place. Quote, since the 17th century, he writes in an essay accompanying his book, this is McCarraher, he goes back to the quote, much modern history has provided good reasons to show that quote-unquote disenchantment is more of a fable, a mythology that conceals the persistence of enchantment in quote-unquote secular disguise. And that's the end of the quote from McCarraher, and back to Kingsnorth's quote. And what is being disguised? Love of money. Capitalism, turns out, McCarraher continues, might be modernity's most beguiling form of enchantment, remaking the moral and ontological universe in its pecuniary image and likeness. If McCarraher is right, we have not junked a sacred order for a profane one. We have instead enthroned a new god and disguised its worship as the disenchanted pursuit of purely material gain. We have dressed up as a mere quote-unquote economy our new idol and sovereign, what I am calling the machine. And that's from page 35. Humans are naturally culture-making beings because humans naturally seek meaning and create stories to make sense of the world around us. It should not be surprising then that while the modern world became disenchanted with God, the void that was left would quickly be filled by some other object of enchantment. I think that McCarraher and Kingsnorth are correct. That said, it's useful to look at the process by which this displacement took place, for it was through foundational tenets of Protestantism that this happened, and the effects of this process affect all of us. Before looking at Protestantism, however, we must go further back to consider what it was that Martin Luther was protesting against: the excesses in spiritual and theological distortions that had arisen in late medieval Europe. Luther was an Augustinian monk living in the early 16th century in Germany, and tormented by what he found to be an intolerable theological system, a conclusion that he came to when he pushed the quote-unquote logic of late medieval Roman Catholic theology to its conclusions. When studying theology and church history, it can be challenging to parse out what was meant by certain words and concepts in a given time, place, language, and culture. I'm going to attempt a thumbnail sketch from an Orthodox perspective of the theological and spiritual distortions that Luther and the other Protestants were reacting against, in particular vis-a-vis the proper Christian understanding of asceticism. Greetings, Stephen in Ottawa. Thanks for being here. So according to the patristic tradition, Christian asceticism is a response to humanity's post-fall condition, the voluntary training of the human person to restore the likeness of God in man that had been distorted through the fall. For the fathers, at the heart and foundation of this undertaking is the Christian's completely voluntary love for God. In the Orthodox Christian tradition, this ascetic effort must not have any aspect of coercion, internal or external, but must be undertaken out of the ecstatic love of the Christian for God. Unfortunately, the asceticism that Martin Luther rebelled against was more coercive and therefore destructive and ultimately self-defeating. By the 16th century, much of medieval Western asceticism had been infected by the legalistic and merit-based system of indulgences. The goal of this system was largely to appease God, reduce guilt, and lessen punishment. The system of indulgences included external acts such as fasting, pilgrimages, flagellation, etc., which, when misinterpreted in the Western context, contributed to a legalistic rather than an ecstatic and loving relationship with God. The result of these distortions was the kind of spiritual anxiety, guilt, and fear of sin that tormented Martin Luther. From the Orthodox perspective, these distortions were unsurprising and the natural result of centuries of bad theology. Unfortunately, rather than returning to the patristic understanding of asceticism and the spiritual life, Luther and the other reformers threw out the baby with the bathwater and created a completely new religion. This provides the backdrop for next week's consideration of Protestantism's rationalization of the spiritual life, which led to the disenchantment of Western Christianity that Weber refers to, and that in turn laid the foundation for MacArthur's quote-unquote enchantment of mammon. I just want to make sure I got the whole thing. Yeah, I did. So I ended up stopping there because it ends up being about a 10-minute video, and in a sense, it could just kind of go on. It could probably be a full book. So I have to kind of decide where I'm going to end each blog post. But the central idea being that at the heart of at least Martin Luther's experience, and this definitely was an experience that I think a lot of Western Christians were having at the same time, was this misunderstanding of asceticism and this coercive nature of it in the West. And it's hard from the outside to tell the difference, but there is a great difference there. And so what happens is as asceticism disappears, and this kind of sense of the other worldliness of Christianity, it becomes more worldly. The world that of medieval Christianity becomes disenchanted, and the object moving forward is, this sense of the calling. Work becomes enchanted, somehow one's secular work is one's path to God rather than just being one aspect of one's life. And so we see in the 21st century this kind of great focus on the career, and that is really the most important thing, making money and so on. So we'll continue to unpack this going forward. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or questions before we close, but I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen over Christmas. I think we'll do one more session on Thursday. We'll do the next 3 chapters, and then on next Monday there'll be another theological blog post and discussion, live stream, and then I think we're going to take a week off and maybe come back on the, I'm not sure, I want to say it's it might be New Year's Day. Anyway, if you want to keep up with the precise dates and times for this and for the book study generally, kind of what we're reading, please sign up for the newsletter. Again, you can find the place to do that in the show notes for this video. So yeah, I don't see any other questions or comments. So glad you joined us, Stephen. And definitely in the future, if as you read Kingsnorth's books, you have any thoughts or questions, please share them. And otherwise, I'm just going to read the blog post and maybe discuss it a little bit more. But things are definitely slowing down in my world as we approach Nativity next week. So, but we will do, I think, 2 more sessions between now and Christmas, God willing. So I'm going to call it a night for now. And thank you, as always, for being here. And have a blessed Nativity season. Good night.